Sometimes the people who love us most can become strangers overnight. When grief strips away everything familiar, we discover who truly stands beside us and who simply walks away. Elsbeth had given 30 years to her village, working the forge with her husband, healing wounds, mending tools. When plague took him and left her alone, those same neighbors saw only a burden. They cast her into the winter snow to die. Wandering into the frozen wilderness with nothing but her sorrow, she collapsed, ready to join her husband. That's when she met Alaric. For 800 years, this ancient vampire had walked the earth alone, carrying the weight of countless sins. When he found Elsbeth dying in the snow, something awakened in his heart that he thought was lost forever. He offered her shelter, not from pity, but from understanding. Two broken souls found each other in the darkest winter. But when the village learned what she had become, they came for both of them. What happens when an immortal creature learns to love again? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The village bell of Grimhaven had called Elsbeth to morning prayers for 37 years, but on this bitter February dawn in 1347, its bronze voice carried a different message. Each toll seemed to echo through the cobblestone streets like a funeral dirge, and perhaps that was fitting. Today, the bell would ring, for the last time in her life, as a daughter of this place. She stood at the window of the cottage she had shared with Thomas for 3 decades, watching the first pale light creep across the thatched roofs. The simple iron band on her finger, her wedding ring, caught the dawn's glow, and she turned it slowly, remembering the day Thomas had placed it there. He had forged it himself in their blacksmith shop, heating and hammering the metal with the same careful attention he gave to every horseshoe, every plough blade, every nail that held the village together. "It's not much to look at," he had said then, his face still flushed from the forge's heat, "but it's made to last forever, forever." The word tasted bitter now. Through the frost-etched glass, she could see smoke rising from chimneys throughout Grimhaven, families beginning their day with warm bread and hot porridge. Children would soon emerge to play in the snow, their laughter ringing through the crisp air. The baker would open his shutters, the weaver would set up her loom by the window, and life would continue exactly as it had for generations. Except now, for the first time in 30 years, there would be no smoke from the blacksmith's forge. Elsbeth pressed her palm against the cold window. This cottage had been her world, small but sturdy, with thick stone walls that kept out the worst of winter's bite. Thomas had built the hearth himself, laying each stone with patient precision. The wooden table where they had shared countless meals still bore the marks of his knife, from evenings when he would carve small figures while she mended clothes or prepared herbs for the villagers who came seeking remedies for their ailments. She had been more than just the blacksmith's wife. When children scraped their knees or farmers cut themselves on their tools, they came to Elsbeth. When women struggled through difficult births, they called for her steady hands and gentle voice. When old bones ached in the winter cold, she brewed the teas that brought relief. For 30 years, she had been woven into the fabric of this community as surely as any thread in the weaver's loom. But fabric could unravel, threads could be pulled free and discarded. The cottage door stood slightly ajar, and through the gap she could hear the murmur of voices in the village square. Elder Marcus would be there, his silver beard catching the morning light as he spoke in the measured tones that had guided Grimhaven through harvest failures, harsh winters, and the occasional dispute between neighbors. He had been Thomas's friend once, had stood beside them at their wedding, had blessed their union with words of hope and prosperity. Yesterday, those same lips had pronounced her exile. "The plague has taken much from us," Marcus had said, his weathered hands folded before him as the village council sat in judgment. "We cannot afford to feed those who cannot contribute. It is not cruelty, Elsbeth. It is survival." She had stood before them in the great hall, where she had attended countless celebrations, her legs trembling beneath her black mourning dress. The faces surrounding her had been familiar: Henrik the baker, whose bread she had bought every morning for 3 decades, Marta the weaver, whose children Elsbeth had helped deliver, Edmund the cooper, whose infected hand she had treated just last summer, all of them avoiding her eyes. "I can still work," she had pleaded. "I know the herbs, the healing arts. The children need food," Marcus had interrupted gently but firmly. "And we have barely enough for those who can work. The fields come spring. You have no husband now, no sons to provide for you. We cannot carry what we cannot bear." The decision had been unanimous. She would be given 3 days to gather what she could carry and leave Grimhaven forever. In winter, at 58, with nowhere to go. Now, on the 3rd morning, she moved through the cottage like a ghost, revisiting the scenes of her life. Every object held memory: the iron pot where she had cooked thousands of meals, the wooden chest where she kept her herbs and simples, each small pouch labelled in Thomas's careful script, the quilt they had shared, pieced together from scraps over their first winter as husband and wife. What could one woman carry into exile? What pieces of a life could be distilled into a bundle small enough for aging shoulders? She had already made her choices: a small knife, a handful of the most precious herbs, the quilt not for warmth alone, but because every stitch held love, and the clothes on her back, her warmest dress, her good cloak, and the worn leather boots Thomas had made for her 5th wedding anniversary. Everything else would remain. The cottage would stand empty until spring, when some younger family might claim it and begin their own story within these walls. The thought should have brought comfort, continuity, the natural cycle of life moving forward. Instead, it felt like erasure. She touched the wooden cross that hung above their bed, remembering the prayers she and Thomas had whispered there. Prayers for children who never came, prayers for good harvests, prayers for health and long life together. God had answered some and ignored others, as was his way. She could not bring herself to feel bitter about it. Faith was not a bargain struck with the divine. It was trust offered freely, even when the world turned dark. The wedding ring slipped easily from her finger now. Her hands had grown thin during the month since Thomas's death, grief stealing her appetite along with her will. She held the simple band up to the light, watching it gleam with the warm glow that only iron could hold. For a moment she considered leaving it behind. What use was a wedding ring to a woman alone? But then she slipped it back into place. She was still Thomas's wife, would always be Thomas's wife, even if death and exile had separated them. A knock at the door interrupted her reverie. She opened it to find young Willem, the blacksmith's apprentice who had worked alongside Thomas for the past 5 years. His face was red with cold and something that might have been shame. "Mistress Elsbeth," he said quietly, "I've come to that is, the council sent me to see me safely beyond the village boundaries," she finished for him. "I understand, Willem. You're only doing as you're told." He shifted his weight from foot to foot, snow crunching under his heavy boots. "I've brought a cart," he said, "to carry your belongings to the forest edge." She looked past him to see a small wooden cart hitched to a patient ox, the same cart they had used to deliver finished work to customers throughout the valley. The irony was not lost on her. "That's kind of you," she said, "but I won't be needing it. I travel light now." Willem's eyes widened as she stepped outside, with only the small bundle she had prepared. "But your household goods, your furniture, surely you'll take." "Where would I use them, Willem? I have no house now." She pulled the cottage door closed behind her, not bothering to bar it. There was nothing left inside worth stealing, and thieves were rare in Grimhaven. Until now, it had been the sort of place where doors could be left unlocked and children could play without fear. They walked in silence through the village streets, their footsteps muffled by the fresh snow that had fallen during the night. A few faces appeared at windows, but none emerged to bid her farewell. She did not blame them. In hard times, people learned to look away from uncomfortable truths. Survival required a certain hardening of the heart. At the village boundary, where the cobblestones gave way to the frozen dirt track that led into the forest, Willem finally spoke again. "I'm sorry, Mistress Elsbeth, about Master Thomas, about all of this. It isn't right." She turned to study his young face, seeing genuine anguish there. Willem was perhaps 22, with the broad shoulders and steady hands that marked a good blacksmith. Thomas had spoken highly of him, had been teaching him the finer points of the craft. In another year or two, he would be ready to take over the forge entirely. "What isn't right," she said gently, "is asking a young man to bear the weight of decisions made by his elders. You're not responsible for this, Willem. Remember that. But I could speak to the council again. Tell them what? That I'm worth more than the food I would eat? That love and loyalty matter more than survival?" She shook her head. "They've made their choice based on the world as it is, not as we wish it could be. You cannot change winter by arguing with the snow." She reached into her bundle and withdrew a small leather pouch, pressing it into Willem's hand. "Seeds," she explained. "Thomas saved them from the herb garden. Plant them, come spring, and remember that some things endure even when all seems lost." Willem's eyes filled with tears as he took the pouch. "Where will you go?" Elsbeth looked toward the forest, where snow-laden pines stretched into the distance like a white sea. Somewhere beyond those trees lay other villages, other towns where a woman with healing skills might find welcome. But they were days of travel away, across wilderness paths made treacherous by ice and cold. The chances of reaching them alive were small. She thought of Thomas, buried now beneath the frozen ground of the churchyard. Soon, perhaps, she would see him again. "I'll find my way," she said simply. As she walked away from Grimhaven, she did not look back. The village bell was ringing again, calling the faithful to morning prayers, and its bronze voice followed her into the forest like a final blessing. The snow crunched beneath her boots as she made her way along the narrow path that traders used in warmer months. Already she could feel the cold seeping through her cloak, but she walked steadily, placing one foot in front of the other with the patience that had carried her through 30 years of marriage and loss. Behind her, the smoke from Grimhaven's chimneys faded into the grey sky. Ahead lay only winter and wilderness, and the uncertain mercy of whatever lay beyond. But she was not afraid. After everything she had endured, the long years of childlessness, the slow decline of her beloved husband, the crushing weight of fear seemed almost trivial. What was exile compared to losing the one person who had made life worth living? The forest embraced her with its ancient silence, and Elsbeth disappeared into the white world beyond, carrying nothing but her memories and the simple faith that some endings were also beginnings. The forest path wound deeper into shadow with each step, and by midday Elsbeth could no longer see the smoke from Grimhaven's chimneys. The snow had begun to fall again, fat flakes that caught in her eyelashes and melted against her cheeks like cold tears. Her breath formed silver clouds in the frigid air, each exhalation a reminder that she was still alive, still moving, still fighting against the inevitable. She had walked this path before, in summers long past, when she and Thomas would venture into the woods to gather herbs for her healing work. Foxglove for heart ailments, willow bark for pain, elderflower for fevers. The forest had always been generous with its gifts for those who knew how to look. But winter had stripped away that generosity, leaving only bare branches and the deep silence of sleeping earth. The bundle on her back grew heavier with each mile. Her shoulders, unused to such sustained burden, began to ache. She paused at a fallen log, brushing away the snow to create a place to sit and rest. The cold bit through her cloak immediately, but she needed these moments to catch her breath and consider her path. Ahead, the trail split in two directions. The main route curved eastward toward the trading post at Millbrook, a journey of perhaps 4 days in good weather. The other path, barely more than a deer track, led north into the deep forest where few travelers ventured. Local tales spoke of that northern route with hushed voices, stories of wolves that walked on 2 legs, of lights that danced through the trees to lead men astray, of ancient things that slumbered in the deepest woods. But the northern path was shorter, and in her condition, shorter might mean the difference between life and death. She stood, shouldering her burden again, and chose the northern route. If the old stories were true, perhaps death would find her more quickly there. She was past fearing legends when starvation and cold were such immediate realities. The afternoon light began to fade earlier than expected, filtered through the thick canopy of pine boughs heavy with snow. Each step became more difficult as the path grew narrower and less defined. Twice she stumbled over hidden roots, catching herself against snow-covered trees that left white handprints on her dark cloak. Her stomach had long since stopped growling. The gnawing hunger of the first day had given way to a hollow emptiness that seemed to echo with each heartbeat. She had not eaten since leaving Grimhaven, had barely managed a few handfuls of snow to slake her thirst. The cold was worse than the hunger, though a creeping numbness that started in her fingers and toes and slowly worked its way inward. As darkness approached, she began to look for shelter. A thick stand of evergreens might provide some protection from the wind, or perhaps a fallen tree would create a windbreak where she could huddle until dawn. But the forest offered no easy sanctuary. Every potential refuge was already claimed by snow or ice, and the wind seemed to find its way through even the thickest branches. She pressed on, stumbling now more than walking, until her foot caught in a hidden depression and she fell hard, her bundle spilling across the snow. For a long moment she simply lay there, tasting blood from where she had bitten her tongue. The snow beneath her face was surprisingly soft, almost welcoming. It would be so easy to simply stay here, to let the cold take her gently into sleep. "Thomas," she whispered, and his name formed a small cloud of vapor that disappeared quickly in the wind. "I tried, my love. I tried to find a new place, a new life, but I think I was meant to join you instead." She closed her eyes and felt the snow beginning to accumulate on her back. Already the cold was becoming less sharp, less painful. The stories said that freezing was a gentle death, that the cold simply carried you away like sleep. Perhaps it was true, but as she lay there, surrendering to whatever fate awaited, she became aware of a presence nearby. Not the rustle of small creatures or the creak of branches in the wind, something larger, something watching. She opened her eyes but saw only the gathering darkness between the trees. Then she heard it, footsteps in the snow, measured, deliberate, moving toward her with purpose. Her heart quickened despite her resignation. Wild animals would not walk so steadily, and she was too far from any settlement for the steps to belong to another traveler. A figure emerged from the shadows between the trees, tall and imposing against the white landscape. At first glance, he appeared to be a man, broad shoulders, long legs, moving with fluid grace despite the difficult terrain. But there was something unusual about his bearing, an otherworldly stillness that made her skin prickle with more than cold. He wore no heavy cloak against the winter, only a long coat of dark leather that seemed untouched by snow. His hair was black as a moonless night and fell past his shoulders, and when he stepped into the small clearing where she lay, she could see that his face was pale as carved marble, beautiful in the way that ancient statues were beautiful, perfect, but somehow removed from human warmth. Around his neck hung an old medallion, tarnished silver that caught what little light filtered through the trees. The symbols etched into its surface were unlike any she had seen before, complex patterns that seemed to shift and change when she tried to focus on them. He approached slowly, as if aware that sudden movement might frighten her. When he knelt beside her in the snow, she caught a glimpse of his eyes, silver-grey like winter ice, ancient beyond his apparent years. "You are far from home, wanderer," he said, and his voice carried an accent she could not place, as if he had learned the language long ago in some distant land. Elsbeth tried to sit up, but found her strength had abandoned her. "I have no home," she replied simply. "Not any more." He studied her face with an intensity that should have been uncomfortable, but somehow was not. There was no pity in his expression, no judgment, only a deep recognition, as if he understood something fundamental about her situation. "You came here to die," he said. "It was not a question. I came here because I had nowhere else to go. If death finds me here, I will not fight it." Something flickered across his features, surprise perhaps, or pain. He was silent for a long moment, and in that silence she became aware of how utterly still he was. No visible breath misted in the cold air, no small movements of someone fighting the chill. He seemed as permanent and unmovable as the ancient trees around them. "What is your name?" he asked finally. "Elsbeth. Though I suppose names matter little to the dying." "Elsbeth," he repeated, and the way he spoke it made it sound like a prayer or an incantation. "I am Alaric. Are you a traveller as well? There is no shelter here. You should seek warmth before full darkness comes." A strange expression crossed his face, something that might have been amusement but held no humour. "I do not fear the cold, Elsbeth, and I think—" He paused, seeming to struggle with some internal decision. "I think perhaps your journey need not end here. I have no strength left for walking, no food, no warmth. The forest will claim me, whether I resist or not." Alaric was quiet again, his silver eyes studying her with an intensity that seemed to pierce through to her very soul. She should have been afraid alone in the wilderness with a strange man whose very presence defied natural law. But fear required energy she no longer possessed, and there was something in his manner that spoke of protection rather than threat. "There is a place," he said slowly, as if each word required careful consideration. "Not far from here, warm, with food and shelter. You could recover your strength there. You speak as if you know this forest well. I have walked these paths for many years." He stood, and she was struck again by his unusual height and the fluid grace of his movements. "The choice is yours, Elsbeth. I can leave you here to embrace whatever end you seek. Or you can allow me to help you find shelter for the night." She looked up at him, this mysterious figure who had appeared from nowhere in her darkest moment. Everything rational told her to be wary, to question his motives and his strange manner. But rationality had little place in a world that had cast her out to die. If this was some trick of exhaustion or approaching death, at least it offered hope. "Why would you help a stranger?" she asked. He knelt again, and this time when he looked at her, she saw something raw and vulnerable in those ancient eyes. "Because I know what it means to be alone in the darkness, because I remember what it was like to believe that no dawn would ever come again." Without waiting for her response, he gathered her scattered belongings and then, with impossible ease, lifted her from the snow. She should have protested, should have insisted on maintaining her dignity even in defeat. Instead, she found herself leaning against his chest, grateful for the strength she no longer possessed. As he carried her deeper into the forest, toward whatever shelter he had promised, Elsbeth felt the medallion around his neck press against her cheek. It was cold as ice, but beneath it, where his heart should beat, there was only silence. She should have been afraid. Instead, for the first time since Thomas's death, she felt safe. Elsbeth awakened to warmth, real warmth, that seemed to penetrate her bones after so many hours of numbing cold. For a moment, she lay still with her eyes closed, convinced that she was dreaming or perhaps already dead. The afterlife, she reasoned, might feel exactly like this, soft bedding beneath her, a gentle heat radiating from somewhere nearby, and the blessed absence of wind and snow. But when she opened her eyes, she found herself in a room that belonged to no heaven she had ever imagined. The chamber was vast, with stone walls that rose to a vaulted ceiling lost in shadow. Tapestries hung between tall windows, their rich colours muted by age, but still beautiful scenes of hunting parties and medieval courts, of knights and ladies in gardens that had long since returned to dust. The bed where she lay was enormous, carved from dark oak and draped with curtains of deep burgundy velvet. Most wonderful of all was the fireplace that dominated one wall. The hearth was large enough for a grown man to stand upright within it, built of the same grey stone as the walls. A fire blazed there with such warmth and brightness that it seemed to hold back not just the cold, but the very concept of winter itself. She had never seen a hearth so grand, so perfectly crafted to be both functional and beautiful. As her eyes adjusted to the dancing light, she began to notice other details. The floor was laid with stones so precisely fitted that no mortar showed between them. Ancient shields and weapons decorated the walls, their metal surfaces gleaming despite obvious age. This was no simple cottage or inn, this was a manor house, perhaps even a castle, though she could not imagine what such a place was doing hidden in the deep forest. "You are awake." The voice came from the shadows beyond the firelight, and she turned to see Alaric rising from a chair she had not noticed before. In the warm glow of the flames, his pale features seemed less stark than they had in the forest, though no less striking. He approached the bed with that same fluid grace she remembered, carrying a wooden tray laden with food. "Where am I?" she asked, struggling to sit up among the pillows. "My home," he replied simply, setting the tray on a table beside the bed. "You have slept through the day and into the evening. I thought you might be hungry when you woke." The aromas rising from the tray made her mouth water despite her confusion. Warm bread, rich soup, honey cakes that reminded her of feast days in Grimhaven. Her stomach clenched with sudden fierce hunger, but she forced herself to focus on more pressing questions. "This place I have never heard tell of any manor in these woods. How long have you lived here?" Something flickered across his expression, too quick to interpret. "Long enough to know the forest paths well. Please, eat. We can speak of such things after you have restored your strength." The kindness in his voice undid her resolve to maintain dignity through interrogation. She reached for the bowl of soup with hands that trembled slightly from weakness, and the first spoonful sent warmth cascading through her body like a benediction. It was well made, seasoned with herbs she recognized and others she did not, rich with meat and vegetables that must have come from some well-stocked larder. As she ate, Alaric returned to his chair, watching her with those unusual silver eyes. The intensity of his gaze should have made her uncomfortable, but instead she found it oddly comforting. When had anyone last watched over her with such careful attention? Even Thomas, dear as he was, had grown accustomed to her presence over the years, taking her well-being for granted as married couples do. "You said you know what it means to be alone," she said between bites of the honey cake. "Are you exiled from your home as well?" In a manner of speaking, his voice carried a weight of sadness that seemed disproportionate to so simple a question. "Though my separation from home is of longer duration than yours." "How long?" He was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his words were carefully chosen. "Long enough to understand that exile changes a person, that sometimes the one who finally returns home is no longer the same one who left." There was something in his tone that suggested painful experience, and she found herself studying his face more carefully. His features were aristocratic, refined in a way that spoke of noble birth. The clothes he wore were well made, though of a style she could not quite place more elaborate than merchant dress, but cut differently than the garments worn by the few nobles she had encountered in her lifetime. "You speak as one educated," she observed. "Yet you live alone in the forest like a hermit." "Education can be a burden as well as a blessing," he replied. "Knowledge of the world's cruelties does not always make one eager to rejoin that world." She finished the soup and sat back against the pillows, feeling more human than she had since leaving Grimhaven. The food had restored not just her physical strength, but something deeper, a sense that perhaps her story was not yet finished. "I should not impose upon your hospitality longer than necessary," she said. "If you could direct me to the nearest village when morning comes, where would you go?" The question was asked gently, without judgment, but it cut to the heart of her situation. There are other settlements beyond the forest, places where healing skills might be welcomed. In winter, alone, with no supplies or coin." He leaned forward slightly, his expression compassionate but realistic. "Elsbeth, you nearly died in the snow yesterday. The next village is days away, through difficult terrain." The truth of his words settled over her like a weight. She had been so focused on the immediate crisis of survival that she had not truly considered what came after. Even if she reached another settlement, what then? She was a stranger with no references, no proof of her skills save her own word. In hard times, towns were no more generous to wanderers than Grimhaven had been to their own. "Then what would you have me do?" she asked, hearing the despair creep back into her voice. "I cannot return to Grimhaven. They have made their position clear." "You could remain here," he said quietly, "at least until spring makes travel safer. The manor is large. There are chambers that have stood empty for years. You would not be a burden." She stared at him in amazement. "You would offer shelter to a complete stranger? For months?" "You are not entirely a stranger," he replied, with a small smile that transformed his austere features. "I know that you are a healer, that you were married to a blacksmith, that you gave 30 years of your life to people who repaid that service with exile. I know that you face death with more courage than most face life. You know very little of me truly, perhaps, but I know that you have shown me more kindness in these few hours than I have received from another soul in—" He paused, seeming to catch himself before completing the thought. "I have shown you kindness. You are the one who saved my life. You have not run screaming into the night despite finding yourself in the home of a stranger. You have not demanded explanations for things that might seem unusual. You accept mysteries with grace." His expression grew more serious. "That is a rare gift, Elsbeth, more rare than you might imagine." There was something in his manner that suggested deeper meanings, layers of significance she could not yet understand. But the warmth of the fire, the comfort of the bed, and the surprising pleasure of companionship after so much solitude made such mysteries seem less important than gratitude. "If you truly mean this offer," she said carefully, "I would be grateful for shelter until spring. But I cannot accept charity without offering something in return. This manor is large. As you say, surely there are ways I could be useful." Relief flickered across his features so quickly she almost missed it. "There are many chambers that could benefit from care, and the kitchens have been too long neglected, but only if such work would not seem beneath you." "Work is never beneath anyone willing to do it honestly," she replied. "I have spent 30 years keeping a household. I know the value of clean rooms and well-prepared meals." He nodded, standing with that fluid grace. "Then tomorrow you may explore the manor and see what tasks appeal to you. For tonight, rest and recover your strength. This chamber is yours for as long as you choose to stay." As he moved toward the door, she called out to him, "Alaric, why are you doing this? Truly?" He paused in the doorway, his back to her, and she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet she almost missed the words. "Because I had forgotten that kindness still existed in the world, and because loneliness is a burden easier borne when shared." Then he was gone, leaving her alone with the dancing firelight and the growing realization that she had stumbled into something far more complex than simple hospitality. The morning light that filtered through the tall windows of the manor was unlike any Elsbeth had ever seen. It seemed softer somehow, as if the glass itself gentled the sun's rays into something more forgiving than the harsh brightness of winter. She had awakened before dawn, a lifetime habit that even exile could not break, and spent the early hours exploring the chamber that Alaric had given her. By daylight, The room's grandeur was even more evident. The tapestries she had glimpsed by firelight told stories in thread and silk, medieval tales of courtly love and noble quests, their colours still vibrant despite obvious age. The furniture was crafted with a skill that spoke of master artisans, each piece perfectly proportioned and lovingly maintained despite years of apparent solitude. When she finally ventured beyond her chamber, she found the manor to be even larger than she had imagined. Corridors stretched in multiple directions, lined with doors that opened onto rooms filled with furniture draped in white cloth. Some chambers showed signs of recent use, a book left open on a table, a wine cup still bearing traces of its contents, while others seemed frozen in time, as if waiting for occupants who had departed years ago. The kitchens, when she finally located them, told a story of their own. They were vast, clearly designed to serve a household far larger than one man, but they had been maintained with obvious care. The great stone hearth was well tended, copper pots gleamed on their hooks, and the larder held provisions enough for a small army. Yet there was a loneliness to it all, a sense of purpose without fulfillment that made her heart ache. She was examining the herb stores, noting supplies that would make any healer envious, when she heard footsteps behind her. "I had wondered if you might find your way here." Alaric's voice carried a note of amusement. She turned to find him standing in the doorway, and in the morning light she could see him more clearly than she had the night before. His clothes were well made, but seemed to belong to no particular time. The cut was elegant but unfamiliar, as if fashioned by a tailor who followed his own vision rather than current style. His dark hair caught the light streaming through the high windows, and those unusual silver eyes seemed to take in every detail of her exploration. "I hope you do not mind my wandering," she said. "I have always found that understanding a house helps one know how to care for it properly." "Not at all. This place has been too long without a woman's touch." He paused, and something flickered across his features. "Without anyone's touch, truly. I fear I am not the most attentive of housekeepers." She gestured toward the well-organized supplies around them. "You maintain the essentials well enough. These herbs are carefully stored, and the provisions show good planning." "Necessity teaches efficiency," he replied, but there was something in his tone that suggested a deeper story. "One learns to preserve what matters when circumstances require it." As they spoke, she found herself studying him more carefully. There was something unusual about his bearing, a stillness that went beyond mere composure. He stood without the small unconscious movements that most people made, no shifting of weight, no subtle adjustments of position. It was as if he had learned perfect control over his body through long practice. "You mentioned that you had knowledge of Thomas's work," she said, remembering their conversation in the forest. "Are you familiar with metalworking?" "I have some experience with it, though not recent." His expression grew thoughtful. "Your husband was skilled in his craft?" "The finest blacksmith for 3 days' ride in any direction," she said with pride that had not dimmed despite her grief. "He could shape iron like other men shape clay, and his work lasted generations. The tools he made for the village, some of them had been passed from father to son, and were still as true as the day he forged them." "Tell me about your life with him," Alaric said, settling into a chair beside the great kitchen table. "If it does not pain you too much to speak of it." She found herself describing the rhythm of their days together, the early mornings when Thomas would build up the forge fire, the careful dance they had developed around each other's work. She spoke of the satisfaction of watching him transform raw metal into tools that would serve families for decades, and of her own pleasure in tending to the hurts and ailments of their neighbors. "We never had children," she said, and was surprised to find that the old pain of that loss had softened into something more like wistful acceptance. "We hoped and prayed, but it was not to be. In time, we learned to find purpose in other ways, in the work we did, in the care we provided to others." Alaric listened with an intensity that was almost unsettling. When she spoke of the simple pleasures of her marriage, quiet evenings by the fire, shared meals, the comfort of familiar routines, his expression grew distant, as if he were remembering something from long ago. "You speak of contentment," he said when she paused, "of finding peace in simple things. That is a wisdom many never achieve." "It was not wisdom so much as necessity," she replied. "When you cannot have what you want most, you learn to treasure what you have." "And what did you want most?" The question was asked quietly, but it cut to the heart of old longings. She was silent for a moment, considering whether to share such intimate truths with this strange, kind man who had saved her life. "A child to carry forward what Thomas and I built together," she said finally. "Someone to remember our stories, to use the tools he made, to carry on the healing arts I had learned. Legacy, I suppose. The assurance that our lives had meaning beyond our own experience." Something in Alaric's expression shifted, becoming almost pained. "And now, with Thomas gone and the village turned against you, do you still seek such legacy?" "I think perhaps I was seeking it in the wrong place," she said slowly, the understanding coming to her even as she spoke. "I thought legacy meant blood and inheritance, continuation through children and grandchildren, but maybe it means something else entirely." "Such as?" "The kindness we show to strangers, the comfort we offer to the suffering, the way we choose to face our own ending." She looked around the kitchen, seeing the potential for warmth and nourishment that had been missing from this grand space. "Maybe legacy is simply the choice to keep living, to keep caring, even when the world seems determined to break us." Alaric was quiet for a long time, and when he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion she did not fully understand. "You speak of wisdom again, whether you recognize it or not." He stood, moving to the window that looked out over what she could now see was a formal garden, winter bare but clearly once magnificent. "I have existed for a very long time, Elsbeth. I have seen empires rise and fall, watched generations pass like seasons. But I had forgotten that the greatest courage is not in grand gestures, but in the daily choice to continue, to care, to hope." There was something in his words that spoke of experiences far beyond anything she could imagine. She found herself wondering again about his past, about the sorrow that seemed to shadow his kindness. "You speak as one who has seen much pain," she said gently. "More than I care to remember," he replied without turning from the window, "but also in these past hours more hope than I had dared expect." As if embarrassed by the admission, he turned back to her with an expression that was carefully composed. "But enough melancholy for one morning. If you truly meant your offer to help with the household, perhaps you could suggest where we might begin." She looked around the kitchen with fresh eyes, seeing not just its grandeur, but its potential. "A good meal, prepared with care and shared in company. That seems to me the heart of any proper household. Then perhaps you would honor me by preparing such a meal?" "It has been," he paused, seeming to calculate, "a considerable time since I have sat down to a dinner made by caring hands." As she began to plan the meal, selecting ingredients from the well-stocked larder, Elsbeth felt something she had thought lost forever: purpose. Not the purpose that came from duty or obligation, but the deeper satisfaction of choosing to nurture and care for another person. Behind her, Alaric remained at the window, but she could feel his attention like a warm presence. For the first time since Thomas's death, she was not alone with her grief. More surprisingly, she found that she was glad. The iron cross atop Grimhaven's church caught the pale winter sunlight as Father Benedict climbed the steps to address the gathering crowd. Word had spread through the village like smoke through thatch. Elsbeth had been seen in the deep forest, not dead as they had assumed, but in the company of something that defied Christian understanding. Old Henrik the baker had been the first to bring the tale, his face white with terror, as he spoke of shadows that moved wrong and eyes that reflected light like a wolf's. He had been checking his snares in the woods when he glimpsed them through the trees, a woman who looked like the blacksmith's widow, and a tall figure that seemed to glide rather than walk. "Unnatural," Henrik had whispered to his wife, who whispered it to the weaver, who told the cooper's son, until the entire village buzzed with fearful speculation. The way he moved, the way the very air seemed to bend around him, and her walking beside him as if she felt no cold, as if winter itself dared not touch her. Now, 3 days after the sighting, Father Benedict stood before his flock with the iron cross heavy in his weathered hands. The symbol had been blessed by 3 generations of priests, had seen the village through plague and famine and the occasional bandit raid. But this threat felt different, older, more fundamental than mere human evil. "My children," he began, his voice carrying the authority of 4 decades in service to God, "we face a darkness that tests our faith and challenges our understanding. The woman we cast out in Christian mercy has returned, but not as she was." Behind him, the church's ancient stones seemed to absorb his words, holding them like prayers. The building had stood for 200 years, had sheltered the faithful through countless trials. But even these consecrated walls felt fragile against what the baker had described. Elder Marcus stood among the gathered villagers, his silver beard gleaming in the weak sunlight. The decision to exile Elsbeth had been his to make, and now it seemed that decision had led to something far worse than a quick death in the snow. "What would you have us do, Father?" Marcus asked, voicing the question that hung unspoken in the cold air. "If she has made some unholy bargain, then we must save her soul if we can," Benedict replied firmly, "and protect our own if we cannot." A murmur ran through the crowd at his words. Among them stood Willem, the young blacksmith who had escorted Elsbeth to the forest's edge. The guilt that had plagued him since that day now mixed with a deeper fear. He remembered the kindness in her eyes, the grace with which she had accepted her exile. Could such a woman truly embrace evil? "I saw no evil in Mistress Elsbeth," Willem said, his voice carrying despite his youth. "She bore her exile with dignity, showed no bitterness toward those who—" "Evil rarely announces itself," Father Benedict interrupted, though not unkindly. "The devil's greatest trick is to appear as an angel of light. If she has indeed made a pact with darkness, it would explain much how she survived the winter cold, how she found shelter in the deep woods where no shelter should exist. The truth was more disturbing than even the priests suspected. Far from any holy understanding, in a manor hidden among ancient trees, Elsbeth stood before Alaric in the great hall, where portraits of long-dead nobles gazed down from shadowed walls. The conversation that had been building between them for days had finally begun, and with it, the acknowledgement of feelings that neither had expected to find. "I cannot pretend ignorance any longer," she said, her voice steady, despite the magnitude of what she was about to address. "There are things about you that speak of more than mere eccentricity." Alaric stood motionless before the great fireplace, its flames casting dancing shadows across his pale features. The vulnerability she had glimpsed in their earlier conversations was more evident now, as if her direct approach had stripped away some of his careful composure. "What things?" he asked quietly. "You cast no reflection in the polished surfaces of this manor. I have seen you standing before mirrors that show the room but not you. Your skin is cold even in the warmest chamber. You speak of time as if you have seen centuries pass, not mere decades." She paused, watching his reaction. "And there is the matter of your stillness. You do not breathe as other men do." For a long moment, the only sound in the vast hall was the crackle of burning wood. When Alaric finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of confession. "You are not afraid," he observed, and it was not a question. "Should I be?" Most would say yes. He turned to face her fully, and in his silver eyes she saw pain that had been carried for far longer than any human lifetime. "What I am, what I have become, is not something that belongs to your world of village churches and morning prayers." "Then tell me what you are," she said simply. "Let me choose for myself whether to fear or accept." He was quiet for so long that she thought he might refuse to answer. When he finally spoke, the words came slowly, as if he were rediscovering a language he had not used in decades. "I have walked this earth for 8 centuries, Elsbeth. I have seen empires crumble and great cities turn to dust. I have watched the Black Death sweep across Europe like a tide of sorrow, have seen wars that consumed entire generations. He paused, studying her face for any sign of the horror he expected to see there. I am what your village priests would call damned, a creature that feeds on blood to sustain an existence that should have ended long ago. The word hung between them like a bridge that could either connect or divide. Vampire. The stuff of whispered legends and children's nightmares, now given flesh and standing before her with gentle eyes and careful hands that had saved her life. "How long have you been alone?" she asked, and the question surprised him so completely that he actually stepped backward. "That is what you choose to ask. Not how many I have killed, not what sins I have committed, not whether your soul is in danger from my presence. I have seen how you tend this manor, how you speak of loneliness as one who knows it intimately. I have watched you struggle to remember human customs, seen you marvel at simple kindness as if it were a miracle." She moved closer to him, close enough to see the silver flecks in his unusual eyes. A monster would not save a dying woman and ask nothing in return. A monster would not sit patiently through stories of my marriage and speak of them with such reverence. "You do not understand what I am capable of," he said, his voice rough with emotions that seemed to surprise him. "The hunger that drives me, the darkness I carry. I understand that you chose to save me rather than feed on me. That speaks to who you are now, not what you might have been." She reached out tentatively, touching his hand with her fingertips. His skin was indeed cold, but it was also gentle. The capacity for kindness does not exist alongside true evil. At her touch, something seemed to break inside him. For the first time in centuries, tears gathered in his ancient eyes, not blood, as the old stories claimed, but clear salt water that spoke of humanity not entirely lost. "I had given up hoping that such acceptance was possible," he whispered, "and I had given up hoping that love might find me again," she replied, and realized as she spoke that it was true. This strange, impossible feeling that had been growing between them was indeed love, not the comfortable affection of her marriage, but something fiercer, more desperate, born from mutual recognition of shared solitude. They stood together in the firelight, vampire and widow, both outcasts from the world they had once known. Neither spoke of the danger this acceptance might bring, though both understood that the village would not view their union with the same charity Elsbeth had shown. Outside, the winter wind carried whispers of prayer and preparation, of holy water blessed and crosses raised against the darkness. But inside the manor's walls, two lonely souls had found each other against all expectation, and for this moment that seemed miracle enough. The blood-red rose should not have been blooming. Elsbeth discovered it on her third week in the manor, tucked away in what had once been a formal garden behind the east wing. Frost covered everything else, the bare branches of ancient fruit trees, the stone benches carved with forgotten coats of arms, the empty fountain that spoke of more prosperous times. But this single rose defied winter's grip, its petals unfurling in impossible crimson beauty against the white landscape. She had been exploring the manor's grounds, learning the rhythm of her new life. When she found the garden, Alaric had not mentioned it, perhaps thinking it too damaged by neglect to warrant attention. But beneath the winter's harsh overlay, she could see the bones of something magnificent, carefully planned pathways, raised beds that would burst with herbs and flowers come spring, and at the center, a rose bush that bloomed as if summer lived eternal in its roots. "You found my mother's garden." She turned to find Alaric standing at the garden's entrance, his expression unreadable as he gazed at the roses. In the weeks since her acceptance of his true nature, their relationship had deepened in ways that surprised them both. Conversations that began over shared meals often lasted until dawn, covering everything from philosophy to the simple pleasure of tending a household. But he rarely spoke of his past, and never of his family. "Your mother planted this?" she asked, gently touching one perfect petal. 300 years ago, when this was still a proper estate. He moved closer, and she could see something vulnerable in his features. She said roses were proof that beauty could endure even the harshest winters if properly tended. The implication of his words settled over her slowly. 300 years meant his transformation had not happened in recent decades, as she had assumed, but in a time when this manor was alive with human voices and laughter. It meant he had been young once, mortal once, with a mother who planted gardens and spoke of endurance. "What was her name?" Elsbeth asked softly. "Catherine." The name came like a prayer. She was the daughter of a French nobleman, married to my father to secure an alliance that became meaningless within a generation. But she brought grace to this place, made it a home rather than merely a fortress. They stood together in the cold garden, two figures dwarfed by the manor's ancient stones. Around them, the silence was profound, no birdsong, no rustle of small creatures, only the soft whisper of wind through bare branches. It was the kind of silence that invited confession. "How did you—" She hesitated, uncertain how to ask about something so fundamentally beyond human experience. "When did you become what you are now?" "On my 28th birthday," he replied without hesitation, as if he had been waiting for this question. "I was the eldest son, heir to lands and titles that stretched for leagues in every direction. I had everything a man could want: wealth, position, a future bride chosen for political advantage." His voice grew distant. "I was also dying." She studied his face, trying to imagine him as a young nobleman facing mortality. Even now, in his supernatural state, she could see traces of what he must have been: the aristocratic bearing, the careful education evident in his speech, the assumption of authority that came from generations of breeding. "A wasting disease," he continued. "The physicians could give it no name, could offer no cure. I grew weaker each day, watching my body fail, while my mind remained sharp enough to understand what was happening. My parents were desperate. They had lost 3 children to various plagues and accidents. I was their last hope for the family line. And someone offered an alternative to death," she guessed. "A traveller came to the manor, claiming to be a scholar interested in our library. He was learned, charming, sophisticated in ways that impressed even my well-educated father." Alaric's expression darkened. "But I sensed something wrong about him, the way he moved, the way he seemed to know things he should not have known. When he offered me a choice between certain death and uncertain existence, I was young enough to believe I understood the bargain I was making." The rose stirred in a breeze that should have been too cold for any living thing to survive. But like its caretaker, it had learned to endure conditions that would kill lesser beings. "Do you regret it?" she asked. He was quiet for a long moment, his silver eyes fixed on the impossible flower. "For most of these 8 centuries, yes. The hunger, the isolation, the knowledge that I had become something my mother would have feared, it seemed a price too high for mere survival." He looked at her then, and his expression was gentler than she had ever seen it. "But these past weeks, watching you bring life back to rooms that have stood empty for decades, hearing laughter echo in halls where only silence has lived, I find myself grateful for the first time since my transformation." The admission hung between them like the rose's fragrance, sweet and unexpected. She reached for his hand, marveling again at how natural the gesture felt, despite everything that should have made it impossible. "The village will not understand," she said quietly. "When they discover where I am, what you are, they will see only the legends, the stories told to frighten children." "I know." His fingers tightened around hers. "Perhaps it would be better if you left before—" "No." The word came without hesitation. "I spent 30 years living a life circumscribed by other people's expectations, other people's fears. I will not do so again. Even if staying means facing their condemnation, their attempts to save you from my influence." She thought of Willem the blacksmith, of Elder Marcus with his silver beard and careful judgments. of Father Benedict with his iron cross and absolute certainty about good and evil. They were not wicked people, but they were people shaped by a world where anything different was dangerous, anything unexplained was evil. "They cast me out to die," she said finally. "They made their choice about my value when times grew hard. Why should I accept their judgment now about what constitutes salvation?" Alaric brought her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her palm. The gesture was courtly, old-fashioned, belonging to an era when such formality meant something deeper than mere politeness. "You are remarkable," he murmured against her skin. "I am a woman who has learned that love is rarer than safety and infinitely more precious." She smiled, feeling the truth of the words even as she spoke them. "Besides, I have grown quite fond of impossible roses blooming in winter gardens." As if responding to her words, the rose released a shower of petals that drifted around them like scarlet snow. Each petal was perfect, untouched by frost or time, carrying the scent of summer afternoons and promises kept across centuries. That night, as they sat before the great hearth sharing a meal she had prepared with herbs from his mother's garden, Elsbeth felt a contentment she had not known since the early days of her marriage. But it was different from what she had shared with Thomas Deeper, perhaps because it was chosen against all reasonable expectation. Outside, the winter wind howled around the manor's ancient stones, but inside, warmth reigned. They spoke of small things, the best way to preserve fruit, the meaning of various herbal combinations, the possibility of expanding the garden come spring. But underneath the domestic tranquility, both were aware of the larger truth that surrounded them. This peace, this unexpected love, this defiance of natural law, it could not remain hidden forever. And when discovery came, it would bring with it all the fury of a world that feared what it could not understand. But for now, in this moment, there was only the firelight and the gentle sound of conversation and the knowledge that neither of them needed to face the darkness alone anymore. The ancient scroll arrived on a night when the wind carried voices, whispers, in a language that predated the common tongue, spoken by beings who moved through darkness as easily as mortals walked in sunlight. Elsbeth had been tending the kitchen fire when she heard them, a chorus of inhuman sounds that made her blood run cold despite the warmth of the hearth. She found Alaric, standing in the manor's great hall, his entire body rigid with a tension she had never seen before. Before him, three figures emerged from shadows that seemed deeper than any cast by torch or candle. They moved with the same fluid grace she had observed in him, but where Alaric carried himself with restraint, these creatures radiated barely contained power. The leader was a woman whose beauty was as terrible as it was perfect. Her skin was marble pale, her hair the deep black of a moonless sky, and her eyes held the cold fire of distant stars. She wore robes that seemed to shift and flow like liquid darkness, and around her throat hung chains of silver set with stones that pulsed with their own inner light. Behind her came two males, equally striking and equally dangerous. One bore the bearing of a warrior, with scars that spoke of battles fought across centuries. The other had the lean build and calculating gaze of a scholar, his pale hands stained with inks that were probably not ink at all. "Alaric, of House Blackthorn," the woman spoke, and her voice carried the authority of ages. "You have been summoned before the Council of Shadows to answer for crimes against the ancient laws." Elsbeth watched in growing horror as Alaric bowed his head in acknowledgement, his defiance crumbling before these newcomers in a way that made her heart clench with sudden fear. "Lady Seraphina," he replied formally, "I had hoped my exile had freed me from council oversight." "Exile?" The vampire woman laughed, a sound like silver bells ringing in an empty cathedral. "You were not exiled, my lord. You abandoned your post, fled your responsibilities, and left an entire realm without its appointed guardian." The words hit Elsbeth like physical blows. Lord, realm, guardian. She looked at Alaric with new eyes, seeing not the gentle hermit who had saved her life, but a figure of power and authority who had kept vital truths from her. The scholar stepped forward, producing from his robes a scroll sealed with black wax and bound with silver wire. The covenant scroll was ancient beyond measure, its parchment yellowed with age, but the writing upon it still clear and binding. "The covenant of the Night Lords," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of law. "Established in the year 847 by common agreement of all vampire bloodlines. Article the 3rd. No Lord of the Night shall abandon his appointed realm without consent of the Council, lest chaos consume both the living and the undead." Alaric closed his eyes as if the words caused him physical pain. "I know the law, Thaddeus. I helped write it." "You helped write it," Seraphina confirmed, circling him like a predator stalking prey. "And yet you violated it the moment something more appealing than duty crossed your path." Her gaze fell upon Elsbeth then, and those inhuman eyes seemed to strip away every secret, every private thought, every moment of happiness she had found in this place. "Ah," Seraphina continued, her voice dripping with disdain, "the mortal pet! How fascinating that the Lord of the Eastern Marches would risk the stability of the supernatural world for a simple peasant woman." "She is not," Alaric began hotly, but the warrior vampire raised a hand to silence him. "You will speak when given permission, my lord," the warrior said, his voice carrying the grinding sound of stone on stone. "Your crimes are severe enough without adding insubordination to the charges." Elsbeth found her voice at last, though it came out smaller than she intended. "What realm? What is this council?" Seraphina smiled, revealing teeth that were perfect and sharp. "Your lover has not told you the whole truth, has he? How delicious. Allow me to enlighten you, mortal." She gestured grandly, and the shadows in the hall seemed to deepen and swirl, forming images that danced across the walls like living tapestries. "For 1,000 years, the supernatural world has been governed by the Council of Shadows," Seraphina began, her voice taking on the cadence of a teacher addressing a particularly slow student. "We maintain the balance between the mortal realm and the creatures that hunt within it. Vampire lords rule territories, ensuring that feeding is controlled, that exposure is minimized, and that the great secret is kept. The shadows showed scenes of dark majesty vampire courts, where creatures of the night gathered in unholy splendor, ancient castles where the undead nobility conducted business that shaped the fates of nations. Alaric was appointed Lord of the Eastern Marches 3 centuries ago," the scholar Thaddeus continued. "His domain stretched from the Rhine to the Danube, encompassing dozens of smaller vampire courts and hundreds of the lesser undead. His responsibility was to maintain order, to prevent wars between bloodlines, to ensure that no single vampire's actions threatened the secrecy we all depend upon." Elsbeth stared at Alaric, seeing him as if for the first time. The gentle hermit who had saved her life, who had spoken of loneliness and shared quiet evenings by the fire, was actually a figure of immense power and responsibility. A lord among creatures of nightmare, charged with governing beings that fed on human blood. "But love made him weak," Seraphina said, her voice laced with contempt. "First, it was grief for his mortal family. He could not accept their natural deaths, could not embrace his role as apex predator. He began to withdraw from his duties, to avoid the necessary cullings that keep vampire populations stable. And now," the warrior added grimly, "it appears love has made him forget his responsibilities entirely. While he plays house with a mortal woman, vampire courts across Eastern Europe descend into chaos. Blood wars have erupted. Mortals have begun to suspect what lurks among them. The very foundations of our world shake because one lord chose sentiment over duty. The weight of revelation crashed over Elsbeth like a tide. Every gentle evening they had shared, every moment of growing intimacy, every declaration of love, all of it had been built upon a foundation of abandonment and betrayal. Not of her, but of an entire supernatural civilization that depended upon Alaric's governance. "How many have died because of your desertion?" Serafina asked Alaric directly. "How many mortals have been slaughtered in the feeding frenzies your absence allowed? How many vampires have met final death in wars you should have prevented?" Alaric's response was barely a whisper. "I did not know." "You chose not to know," the scholar corrected harshly. "You chose to ignore the summons we sent, to pretend that your realm could govern itself, while you pursued domestic bliss with a creature whose lifespan is but a heartbeat compared to your own." The council's words painted a picture that filled Elsbeth with horror. She had thought herself blessed to find love again, had believed that their unusual relationship was a miracle of acceptance and understanding. Instead, she had become the cause of untold suffering, the reason for Alaric's abandonment of duties that kept supernatural evil in check. "What is the council's judgment?" Alaric asked, his voice hollow with defeat. "Return to your realm immediately," Serafina commanded. "Resume your duties as Night Lord, restore order to your domain, and accept responsibility for the damage your absence has caused. And if I refuse, then you forfeit your immortality and face final death, while your realm is absorbed by neighboring lords who may not share your—" The ultimatum hung in the air like a poison cloud. Elsbeth understood with crystalline clarity that there was no third option, no compromise that could preserve both love and duty. Either Alaric would return to his role as a supernatural lord, a position that would require him to sanction and oversee the feeding upon human blood, or he would die, and his death would unleash even greater horrors upon the world. "How long do I have to decide?" he asked. "Until tomorrow's sunset," Serafina replied coldly. "We will return then for your answer. Choose wisely, my lord. The fate of more than just your heart depends upon it." The three council members dissolved back into shadow, leaving only the whisper of their presence and the devastating truth they had revealed. In the sudden silence, Elsbeth and Alaric stood apart, separated not by distance, but by the enormity of what had been laid bare between them. "Is it true?" she asked finally. "All of it?" "Yes," he replied, and the single word contained multitudes of pain. "I was, exactly what they described, a lord among monsters, responsible for governing creatures that view humanity as nothing more than sustenance. And you abandoned all of that for me. I abandoned it for the chance to remember what it felt like to be human again. You were not the cause, Elsbeth. You were the catalyst that made me realize how far I had fallen from what I once was." She closed her eyes, feeling the weight of thousands of lives hanging in the balance. Everything she had found here, the warmth, the love, the sense of purpose, had been purchased with blood she had not known was being spilled. "What will you do?" she asked. When she opened her eyes, she found him looking at her with an expression of infinite sadness and terrible resolve. "I will choose," he said quietly. "And whatever choice I make, it will destroy something irreplaceable." The ancient sword had not tasted battle in 3 centuries, but as Alaric drew it from its resting place above the manor's great hearth, the blade sang with a resonance that spoke of purpose renewed. Forged during his mortal youth by the finest smiths in his father's realm, the weapon had been blessed by priests, quenched in holy water, and inscribed with protective runes that still gleamed silver against the dark steel. Elsbeth watched from the doorway as he tested the sword's balance, his movements flowing with the muscle memory of a warrior trained from childhood. In the hours since the council's departure, he had transformed before her eyes from the gentle hermit she had come to love into something far more dangerous, a lord preparing for war. "You mean to fight them," she said. "And it was not a question." "I mean to choose my own fate," he replied without looking up from the blade. "For 800 years I have been bound by duty, by expectation, by the weight of responsibilities I never truly chose. Perhaps it is time to discover what it means to be free." The manor around them seemed to pulse with anticipation, as if the ancient stones themselves understood that change was coming. Servants' bells that had been silent for decades suddenly rang in empty corridors. Portraits of long-dead nobles gazed down from their frames with expressions that seemed more alert than usual. Even the air felt charged, like the moments before a thunderstorm breaks. Throughout the long day, they had prepared for what was to come. Alaric had shown her hidden passages within the manor's walls, secret chambers where she could retreat if the confrontation went badly. He had given her vials of holy water blessed by priests who had died centuries before her birth, silver crosses that burned his flesh to touch, and weapons that might harm creatures of supernatural strength. But Elsbeth had set aside each protective measure with quiet determination. "I will not hide while you face this alone," she had told him repeatedly. "Whatever comes, we will meet it together." Now, as sunset approached with ominous speed, she found herself thinking not of escape, but of the choice that had brought them to this moment. The revelation of Alaric's true nature, not just as a vampire, but as a lord among vampires, should have horrified her. The knowledge that their love had contributed to supernatural chaos across half of Europe should have filled her with guilt beyond bearing. Instead, as she watched him prepare for what might be his final battle, she felt only a crystalline certainty that love, once found, was worth any cost. "Tell me about the realm you governed," she said, settling into a chair near the fireplace. "Help me understand what you are being asked to return to." He paused in his preparations, the sword held loosely in his hands as memories flickered across his features like candlelight. "The eastern marches were vast," he began slowly, "stretching from mountain peaks that touched the clouds to valleys where mist never lifted. Within those borders lived dozens of vampire courts, some ancient beyond measure, others newly formed from mortals I had judged worthy of transformation." The picture he painted was both beautiful and terrible. Courts where vampire nobility gathered in halls that rivaled any mortal palace, conducting business that shaped the fate of nations. Libraries filled with knowledge accumulated over millennia. Art and music created by beings who had outlived the civilizations that birthed them. But underneath the beauty was the foundation of blood, he continued, his voice growing heavy with old guilt. "Every vampire under my rule fed upon human life. It was my responsibility to ensure that feeding remained controlled, hidden, sustainable. I allocated hunting territories, mediated disputes over particularly appealing prey, and ordered the deaths of any who threatened exposure." "You ordered deaths?" "Of vampires who fed too openly, who killed too frequently, who showed signs of madness that comes with extreme age." His silver eyes met hers, "but also of mortals who learned too much, who asked too many questions, who posed threats to our secrecy." The admission hung between them like a sword blade. For all his gentleness with her, for all the tenderness he had shown, Alaric had once been a creature who ordered the deaths of innocent humans to protect supernatural interests. "How many?" she asked quietly. "I stopped counting after the first century," he replied, and the pain in his voice was genuine. "Tell me, Elsbeth, knowing this, understanding what I was and what I might become again, do you still believe love is worth any cost?" She was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with truths that challenged everything she thought she knew about good and evil, right and wrong. The man before her had saved her life, had shown her kindness when the world offered only cruelty, had given her a reason to hope when hope seemed impossible. He had also orchestrated the deaths of people who might have been exactly like her ordinary mortals, trying to live their lives with dignity and love. "The man who ordered those deaths is not the man who carried me from the snow," she said finally. "The Lord who governed through fear and control is not the person who has spent these weeks learning to laugh again, learning to find joy in simple domestic pleasures. They are the same person, Elsbeth. I am both of those beings, and if I return to my realm, if you return, you will not be the same Lord you were before." she interrupted with sudden, fierce conviction. Love has changed you, just as it has changed me. You cannot step back into that role as if these weeks never happened. Outside, the last light of day was fading into the deep purple of twilight. Soon, the council would return for their answer, and the choice that would determine not just their fate, but the fate of countless others, would have to be made. There is another possibility, Alaric said quietly, setting the sword aside and moving to kneel before her chair. I could turn you, make you like me. If you were vampire as well, you could rule beside me, help me transform what vampire lordship means. The offer hit her like a physical blow. Immortality, eternal love, the power to reshape a supernatural realm according to their shared vision of what it could become. But also eternal hunger, the need to feed upon human blood to survive, and the gradual erosion of humanity that came with outliving everyone and everything she had ever known. What would that make me? She asked. Powerful enough to survive what is coming, strong enough to stand beside me as we face the council and their demands. She touched his face, feeling the marble coolness of his skin, the sharp angles of cheekbones that had been carved by centuries of supernatural existence. And would I still be me? Would I still feel as I feel now, love as I love now? Or would the hunger eventually consume that as well? He could not answer, and his silence was answer enough. The vampire lords she had seen in the council carried themselves with absolute authority, but she had seen no warmth in them, no trace of the ordinary human emotions that made life meaningful. I need to remain human, she said gently but firmly. Not because I fear what I might become, but because someone needs to remember what it feels like to be mortal. Someone needs to remind you of what it means to choose mercy over power. Before he could respond, the temperature in the great hall plummeted. Frost began forming on the windows despite the roaring fire, and shadows gathered in corners where no shadows should exist. The Council of Shadows had returned, and with them came the weight of supernatural law that had governed the night for a millennium. Lady Seraphina materialized first, her terrible beauty unmarked by any sign of the day's passage. Behind her came Thaddeus the scholar and Marcus the warrior, their presence filling the hall with power that made the air itself seem thick and difficult to breathe. "Have you reached a decision, Lord Blackthorn?" Seraphina asked, her voice carrying the authority of ages. Alaric rose to his feet, his hand moving instinctively to the sword he had set aside. But before he could speak, Elsbeth stood as well, moving to place herself beside him in a gesture that was both protective and defiant. "We have," she said, speaking for both of them. "But first, we would hear exactly what returning to his realm would require. What specific duties, what compromises, what acts would be demanded of him?" Seraphina's perfect features arranged themselves into an expression of cold amusement. "The mortal presumes to negotiate with the council? How delightfully naive." "The mortal," Elsbeth replied with steel in her voice, "presumes to love someone enough to ensure he makes an informed choice. If you want his cooperation, you will provide clarity about what cooperation means." For a moment, the vampire lady seemed genuinely surprised by such directness. Then she laughed, the sound like ice breaking on a winter river. "Very well," Seraphina said. "Let us speak plainly about what lordship entails." What followed was a catalogue of horrors dressed in the language of administrative necessity, the feeding quotas that had to be maintained to prevent vampire starvation, the territorial disputes that required resolution through combat or execution, the mortal authorities who had to be corrupted or eliminated to maintain secrecy, the occasional culling of human populations to prevent them from growing too numerous or too curious. And of course, Thaddeus added with scholarly precision, there is the matter of succession. A vampire lord without progeny is a realm without a future. You would be expected to create new vampires, to expand the bloodline, to ensure continuity of rule. As they spoke, Elsbeth felt her heart growing heavy with the weight of understanding. This was not a position that could be reformed or gentled. It was a role that required its occupant to view humanity as resources to be managed rather than people to be cherished. When they finished their recitation, silence fell over the great hall like a shroud. The choice before them was no longer abstract, it was specific, detailed, and utterly without compromise. Alaric looked at her, and in his ancient eyes she saw love and desperation and the terrible clarity of someone who had finally reached the end of all possible roads. "I know what I must do," he said quietly, and as the words left his lips, Elsbeth realized that she knew as well the choice he would make, the price they would pay, and the battle that was about to begin. The sacred moonlight, streaming through the manor's great windows, seemed to strip away all pretense, as Alaric raised his ancient sword and spoke the words that would change everything. "I renounce my lordship," he declared, his voice carrying across the vast hall with unwavering resolve. "I abdicate my position as ruler of the Eastern Marches and refuse to return to duties that require me to forget what it means to be human." The effect was immediate and terrible. Lady Seraphina's perfect features twisted with fury that had been building for centuries, while Marcus, the warrior's scarred hands, moved to weapons that had ended the existence of countless supernatural beings. Even scholarly Thaddeus abandoned his usual composure, his pale face darkening with anger that spoke of laws violated and order threatened. "You condemn thousands to chaos," Seraphina hissed, her voice carrying harmonics that made the windows rattle in their frames. "You choose one mortal woman over the stability of our entire civilization." "I choose love over dominion," Alaric replied, and as he spoke, Elsbeth moved to stand beside him. "I choose hope over the perpetuation of systems that treat sentient beings as livestock." The moonlight seemed to pulse brighter, washing over them in waves that revealed truth in ways that ordinary illumination could not. Under its influence, the council members appeared as they truly were, ancient predators whose beauty masked appetites that had consumed nations. But Alaric, standing in that same revealing light, showed none of their predatory essence. Instead, he glowed with something that defied supernatural law, a vampire who had somehow retained his humanity despite 8 centuries of existence. "Then you choose death," Marcus growled, drawing a blade that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "And she dies with you for witnessing what mortals should never see." But as the warrior vampire moved forward with inhuman speed, something unexpected happened. The manor's ancient stones began to resonate with power that had been dormant for generations. Protective wards that Alaric's mortal ancestors had woven into the very foundation awakened, responding to the presence of their rightful heir and his freely chosen companion. Light exploded from the walls, not the cold illumination of moon or star, but the warm, golden radiance of summer sunshine. It struck the 3 council members like a physical blow, forcing them back toward the shadows they had emerged from. "Impossible," Thaddeus whispered, his scholarly composure shattered. "No vampire can command the light. No creature of darkness can." "He is not entirely a creature of darkness anymore," a new voice interrupted, and through the manor's great doors came figures that none of them had expected. Elder Marcus of Grimhaven entered first, his silver beard catching the supernatural light as he carried the iron cross that had blessed his village for generations. Behind him came Father Benedict, his weathered hands steady despite the terror in his eyes. And with them, to Elsbeth's amazement, came Willem the young blacksmith, carrying tools that gleamed with more than mere craftsmanship. "We felt the disturbance," Father Benedict said, his voice barely steady. "Darkness so profound it pulled at our very souls. We came to save Elsbeth from whatever evil had claimed her." But as the priest looked around the hall, taking in the supernatural beings frozen by unexpected light, The woman he thought they had come to rescue, standing freely beside a creature that should have been her captor. His expression shifted from certainty to confusion. "Mistress Elsbeth," Willem called out, his young voice cracking with emotion. Have they harmed you?" "I am unharmed," she replied, her voice carrying across the charged air with surprising strength. "But you should not have come here. This is not a battle for mortal weapons." Lady Seraphina recovered first from the shock of the protective wards, her cold beauty reasserting itself despite the painful light that surrounded her. "How touching," she said with venomous sweetness. "The mortals come to rescue their cast-off refuse. Tell me, priest, did you feel such urgency to save her when you cast her into the snow to die?" The accusation hit its target with devastating accuracy. Father Benedict's face went pale as he remembered his own role in Elsbeth's exile, the carefully reasoned arguments he had made about limited resources and necessary sacrifices. "We, the village council, decided," he began, but his words faltered under the weight of his own hypocrisy. "You decided she was expendable," Seraphina continued mercilessly, "worth less than the food she would consume. And now you come to save her from the only being who showed her true kindness in her darkest hour." Elder Marcus stepped forward, the iron cross trembling in his weathered hands. "Whatever kindness he may have shown, he is still a creature of evil, an abomination that feeds upon human blood." "Yes," Alaric said simply, and his honesty cut through the tension like a blade. "I am a vampire. I have fed upon human blood for 8 centuries. I have ordered deaths and overseen horrors that would drive mortal minds to madness." The admission should have sent the villagers fleeing in terror. Instead, Willem the blacksmith stepped forward, his young face set with determination. "But you saved her," he said. "When we left her to die, you gave her life. That has to count for something." The council members watched this exchange with growing amazement. In their long existence, they had never witnessed mortals voluntarily engaging with vampires as equals rather than prey. The very concept defied every law of their civilization. "You see," Thaddeus said, turning to his companions, "this is what comes of allowing sentiment to override necessity. The natural order corrupted, the proper relationship between predator and prey dissolved into something better," Elsbeth interrupted firmly. "Into the possibility that ancient enemies might become allies, that understanding might replace fear." The moonlight pulsed again, and in that moment of perfect illumination, everyone in the hall could see the truth that Seraphina had tried to deny. Alaric's transformation through love had not made him weak, it had made him something unprecedented, a bridge between worlds that had been enemies since the dawn of time. And now both worlds stood on the threshold of a change that would reshape everything they thought they knew about good and evil, predator and prey, monster and man. The tears came without warning, silver drops that caught the moonlight as they traced paths down Alaric's pale cheeks. For 800 years he had believed himself beyond such mortal expressions of emotion. For 8 centuries he had carried the burden of immortality with the cold dignity expected of his kind. But as he looked around the great hall at Elsbeth standing beside him with unwavering loyalty, at the villagers who had come to save her despite their own fears, at the council members who represented everything he was choosing to leave behind, something fundamental broke inside him. "I remember," he whispered, his voice rough with wonder. "I remember what it felt like to weep for joy, to feel my heart break with love so pure it hurt." Lady Seraphina stared at the impossible sight, a vampire lord, shedding tears that were not blood, crying with an emotion that belonged to the living rather than the undead. Her perfect composure cracked as she witnessed something that violated every law of their existence. "This is madness," she breathed. "Vampires do not, we cannot." "Love," Alaric finished for her, and with that single word, everything changed. The power that had been building in the manor's ancient stones suddenly focused not on protection but on transformation. The golden light that had driven back the council now turned inward, flowing into Alaric like sunlight absorbed by winter earth. His supernatural strength remained, but the cold marble perfection of his skin gave way to something more human, warmer, more alive, touched with the flush of blood that had not flowed in his veins for centuries. Father Benedict stumbled backward, his iron cross forgotten as he witnessed a miracle that challenged everything he thought he knew about the divine. "Impossible," the priest whispered. "The damned cannot be redeemed. Evil cannot choose good without—" "Without what?" Elsbeth asked sharply. "Without your permission? Without fitting into your understanding of how the world works?" She moved to Alaric's side, taking his hand without fear or hesitation. The touch of her mortal warmth against his transformed flesh completed something that had been building between them since their first meeting in the snow. "Look at him," she commanded the assembled crowd, vampires and mortals alike. "Really, look. See what love can accomplish when it is freely given and freely received." The council members had no answer for what they were witnessing. Marcus the warrior lowered his dark blade, uncertainty replacing his eternal confidence. Thaddeus the scholar stared with the expression of someone whose deepest certainties had just been shattered. Even Seraphina's terrible beauty seemed diminished by confusion and something that might have been fear. It was Willem who broke the silence, the young blacksmith stepping forward with tears in his own eyes. "Mistress Elsbeth," he said quietly, "we came to bring you home. The village, we realize we made a mistake, a terrible mistake." Elder Marcus nodded, his silver beard trembling with emotion. "We were afraid, and fear made us cruel. We forgot that you had given 30 years of your life to caring for others. We forgot that mercy is more precious than security." "And you would welcome me back now?" Elsbeth asked. "Knowing what I have become, knowing who I love?" Father Benedict struggled visibly with conflicting doctrines before finally speaking. "I have spent 40 years preaching about divine love, conquering all darkness," he said slowly. "How can I deny what I see before me? How can I call evil what has clearly brought forth good?" The priest's words struck Lady Seraphina like a physical blow. For the first time in her long existence, she faced the possibility that the fundamental assumptions of vampire civilization might be wrong, that the eternal war between light and darkness was not inevitable, that redemption might be possible even for creatures she had believed irredeemably damned. "This changes nothing," she said, but her voice lacked its earlier conviction. "One anomaly does not invalidate centuries of—" "It changes everything," Alaric interrupted, and when he spoke, his voice carried authority that was somehow greater than any he had possessed as a vampire lord. "It proves that the choice between light and darkness is always available. That love is stronger than hunger, mercy more powerful than dominion." He turned to face the council directly, and in his transformed features they saw something that terrified them more than any holy weapon or blessed light. "Hope. I renounce not just my lordship," he continued, "but the entire system that makes such lordship necessary. There has to be another way, a path that doesn't require some beings to be predators and others to be prey." "Naive fool," Seraphina spat, but her anger was tinged with desperation. "You would destroy the order that has kept our kind alive for millennia." "I would replace it with something better," he replied. "Something built on coexistence rather than dominion, on mutual respect rather than fear." The moonlight pulsed one final time, and in its revealing glow, everyone present could see the truth that would reshape both their worlds. The ancient enmity between vampire and mortal was not written in stone. The cycle of predator and prey could be broken. It would require courage from both sides. It would demand that mortals look beyond their fears and vampires transcend their appetites. But it was possible. The tears on Alaric's cheeks had proven it. And as Lady Seraphina looked around the hall, seeing mortals and vampires standing together without violence, witnessing love where only hatred should exist, she began to understand that her world would never be the same. Spring had come early to the forests surrounding the manor, as if the earth itself celebrated the transformation that had taken place within those ancient walls. Where winter had once held dominion for months beyond counting, now green shoots pushed through the last patches of snow, and the air carried the scent of renewal that spoke of endings becoming beginnings. Elsbeth stood in her mother-in-law's garden, tending roses that bloomed with impossible beauty in the warming sunshine. The blood-red blossoms that had defied winter's grip now shared their beds with new varieties. White roses for peace, pink for hope, and yellow for the joy that had taken root in soil once thought barren. Around her throat hung a simple wooden ring, carved from oak that had grown in these very grounds. Beside it hung another, equally plain, equally precious. She had made them both herself, during the long nights of planning that had followed the council's retreat, using skills learned from watching Thomas work but applied to a gentler purpose. The matching ring rested on Alaric's finger as he emerged from the manor's great doors, carrying a tray laden with the simple feast they would share to mark this most important of days. 6 months had passed since that night when tears and moonlight had rewritten the laws of supernatural existence. 6 months of rebuilding, of learning, of discovering what it meant to love without fear. "The delegation from Grimhaven has arrived," he said, setting the tray on the stone table that had been his mother's favorite place for morning meals. "Father Benedict sends word that they are ready to proceed." She smiled, brushing earth from her hands as she moved to join him. The changes in Alaric were still miraculous, to witness the way sunlight no longer pained him, how his reflection now appeared clearly in mirrors, the steady rhythm of heartbeat and breath that marked his return to a more human existence. He retained his supernatural strength and extended lifespan, but the cold hunger that had defined 8 centuries of existence had been replaced by something warmer and infinitely more satisfying. "And Lady Seraphina?" Elsbeth asked. "Will the council honor the agreement? She arrived an hour ago, though I suspect she still hopes to find some flaw in our proposal that will allow her to reject it." His expression grew thoughtful. Change is difficult for those who have found security in ancient certainties. The agreement they spoke of had taken months to negotiate, countless meetings between representatives of both worlds, and compromises that had challenged everyone involved. But at its heart lay a simple truth. The old ways of predator and prey, of dominion and subjugation, no longer served anyone's true interests. Under the new covenant, vampires who chose transformation would be welcomed in communities that understood their nature. In exchange for sanctuary and acceptance, they would use their supernatural abilities to protect rather than prey upon the mortal realm. Ancient knowledge would be shared rather than hoarded. The isolation that had bred mistrust on both sides would give way to careful cooperation. It was not perfect, no system built by imperfect beings could be. But it was hopeful in ways that the old laws had never been. "Do you have regrets?" Elsbeth asked as they settled at the table together. "About leaving your lordship? About choosing this uncertain path instead of the power you once wielded?" Alaric considered the question as he poured wine that caught the afternoon light like liquid gold. Around them, the garden buzzed with the gentle industry of bees and the song of birds that had returned to nest in trees that had stood empty for too long. "I regret the years I spent believing that love was weakness," he said finally. "I regret the time lost to duty that felt noble, but was merely fear dressed in the language of responsibility. But choosing you? Choosing this?" He gestured to encompass not just the garden, but the life they had built together. "That I will never regret." The sound of approaching voices carried across the grounds Father Benedict's measured tones, Willem's eager questions, and underneath it all, the careful formality of Lady Seraphina addressing mortals as equals rather than sustenance. The wedding ceremony was about to begin, blessed by representatives of both worlds and witnessed by communities that had learned to see past ancient prejudices. As they rose to greet their guests, Elsbeth caught sight of their reflection in the manor's great windows, a woman of 58 who had found love when she thought her story was ending, and a man who had discovered that 800 years of existence had simply been preparation for this moment when eternity gained meaning. "Are you ready, Mrs. Blackthorne?" he asked, offering his arm with courtly grace. "I have been ready since the night you carried me from the snow," she replied, taking his offered arm and feeling again the miracle of warmth that flowed between them. "Though I confess, I never imagined our wedding would be attended by both vampire nobility and village priests. The best stories are the ones we never see coming," he said, and she could hear in his voice the echo of all the stories he had witnessed across centuries of existence. The ones that teach us that even the darkest winters can give way to spring. They walked together toward the great hall where their friends and former enemies waited to witness the union of widow and vampire, of mortal hope and immortal devotion. Behind them, the garden bloomed in defiance of every natural law, a testament to the power of love to create beauty where only wilderness had existed before. The wooden rings they wore caught the light as they moved, simple bands that carried more meaning than any crown or lordship ever could. They had been carved with patient hands during quiet evenings by the fire, shaped with tools that owed nothing to supernatural power and everything to the human desire to create something lasting from whatever materials love could find. In the distance, church bells rang not in warning this time, but in celebration of the impossible made manifest. The sound carried across valleys and through forests, announcing to any who cared to listen that some endings were truly beginnings, and that even the most unlikely love could grow strong enough to change the world. As they crossed the threshold into their new life together, spring sunshine streamed through ancient windows, warming stones that had witnessed centuries of solitude and blessing them now with the promise of companionship that would endure far beyond the changing of seasons.